Welcome to Conversations. I'm Muqtadar Khan, your host, and today I have with me a very distinguished policy person. We have with us Mr. Haris Tareen, who is the Vice President of Muslim Public Affairs Council. He is an old friend. We have done lots of work together in the past. So Haris is a very interesting person. He has worked in the Department of Homeland Security for more than 10 years and was also in some way in charge of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, for which Joe Biden has received much criticism. But more importantly, he has also helped resettle about 150,000 Afghans, not just in Europe and other places. But there seems to be a lot of questions about what is happening there, because one thing that I noticed was that whatever spike we are seeing in investments in Afghanistan, a lot of it is coming from Afghans who are returning to Afghanistan, or those who have been pushed back or forced to go back. But we are looking at about 5 years of Taliban rule. I think they took over on the 15th of August, and by the end of August, they were in charge of Afghanistan. So we're looking at what has happened in Afghanistan in the last 5 years. There are some positives. There is peace and stability and consolidation, but there are several drawbacks. We'll talk both about it. But Haris, welcome to Conversations.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Khan. I appreciate all of your work, and we've gone back so many years. So thank you so much for having me today. It's 5 years since the withdrawal, so it's a very pertinent time to talk about this issue.
So I want to start off with right away with there. So you probably had a very close view of what was happening during the withdrawal, and the general perception is that it was badly managed by the United States. Partly we didn't anticipate the government that we had invested in to collapse so quickly, and the disaster that happened with the terrorist attacks on the airport. So can you just run us back and say what was the administration thinking at that time when they were withdrawing, and were they aware that they were basically abandoning Afghanistan to a terrible fate at the hands of the Taliban? And what has happened to a lot of those Afghans who worked with the US and various Western countries, who the Taliban might not be happy with them now, and they are abandoned?
Yeah. Well, thank you again. I'll start by something I tell a lot of people. I used to tell people when I was in government, and I still tell people this. If you ever have imposter syndrome, or if you ever feel like you're a failure in life, just look at U.S. policy towards Afghanistan. The U.S. went into Afghanistan in 2001 after September 11th. Excuse me. And then 20 years later, the U.S. By that time had spent over $1 trillion. Thousands of U.S. soldiers' lives had been sacrificed. Hundreds of thousands of innocent Afghan lives had been sacrificed. Thousands of Pakistani lives had been sacrificed. And then 20 years later, the U.S. handed on a silver platter the country with weapons and reconstruction of 20 years and billions of dollars in investment to the same group of people. So it's an interesting case study in the failure of even what a superpower can do in a region or in a country without having a critical understanding, cultural context, historical context, geographical and regional context. As you mentioned, you asked me what was the administration, specifically the Biden administration, what were they thinking? I wish I could tell you that they were thinking. I don't think they were thinking much at all. And this started during the first Trump administration. When they decided, the first Trump administration, the decision was made that they would pull out of Afghanistan. And that process started then. The peculiar situation was that, we had been propping up funding and investment in the government, as you said, the Republic, people like Karzai and Ashraf Ghani and others. We had been investing, billions of dollars in these governments over the years. And we decided at one point that we were going to withdraw. And I knew that, I think everyone knew that the withdrawal was inevitable. But how the withdrawal was done was absolutely disastrous. What we did was we started to negotiate directly with the Taliban, and the Taliban knew that if they bypassed the republic government and negotiated directly with the United States, that they would receive so much more and would be able to leverage the process so much more. And that's exactly what happened. We bypassed the sitting government in Afghanistan that we had supported, that we were funding, and we were keeping afloat. We decided that they shouldn't be part of the initial negotiations. And we didn't push the Taliban to include them in the initial negotiations. We negotiated directly with the Taliban. And if you remember in Doha, the famous picture between Mullah Brother and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, where they signed the agreement, which was held secretly. There was no public knowledge of the agreement, what was in the agreement, what was the withdrawal process. And so the government had no idea what was happening. And the government, of course, became nervous. And when the Biden administration came in, and Biden notoriously and historically was known not to really have an affinity towards Afghanistan at all. He thought the original investment that Obama made to increase the troops in Afghanistan was a mistake. He wanted to withdraw earlier. He did not want to invest any more resources into Afghanistan. And he didn't think Afghanistan was a geostrategic asset for the United States. So he really did not care at all. So when the Biden administration took over, part of the platform that they had run on was to end these forever wars. And so they started to withdraw from Afghanistan and pull out. And they did start that process. Of course, they started to pull out a lot of the civilian infrastructure and U.S. aid infrastructure, and then the contracting infrastructure that they had created to prop up this government and the military of that government. So when they started to withdraw all these pieces, it had a domino effect. When you withdraw the U.S. aid, the communities are not getting aid. They were dependent. Unfortunately, they had built an aid-dependent society in many ways in Afghanistan over the 20 years that they were there. They started to pull out the contractors that were supporting the military infrastructure, the helicopters, all of the different military assets. When that happens and they couldn't function in Afghanistan, the military then was impacted by it. And so that had a domino effect. And the Taliban knew this. The Taliban, for them, it was a waiting game, a very strategic waiting game for them. They knew that they had more support on the ground than the government had. And when the U.S. started to slowly pull back all of these assets, the Afghan government had a choice. And the Afghan government's choice was, do we keep fighting and not without the same infrastructure and cause more bloodshed than we have already had, or do we allow the Taliban to come and take over? And I think the decision that Ashraf Ghani and his advisors made at that point were that because they were not happy with the U.S., they were not happy with how the U.S. was withdrawing. The decision that Ashraf Ghani made was that I'm not going to take on a big street-by-street battle in Kabul, Afghanistan, and other major cities like Herat and Mazar and other places. The South had already been gone to the Taliban by that time. And so the strategic decision, or whatever you want to call it, made by the Ashraf Ghani administration was that we're going to completely withdraw, allow this to collapse, and let the Taliban deal with it, and not give them the legitimacy of being the legitimate governors and government of this country, because essentially what they thought was that the U.S. and Taliban had struck up a deal, and the Taliban would take over the majority of the government, and they would give some symbolic positions to the Republic folks and others, and they would head and lead the government in Kabul. And so they withdrew, and they, if you know Afghan governance structures, you know that there's multiple Pashtun tribes that have had the governing structure in Afghanistan, in modern Afghanistan, for the past over 100 years. It's the Durrani and the Ghilzai
Yeah.
tribes of Afghanistan, and the majority of the time the governance structure was led by the Durrani government. And the current Taliban senior leadership in Kandahar are the Durranis. So they essentially gave that over to. They tried to give it over to Kabul. They allowed the Haqqani wing of the Taliban, which is more of the Ghilzai wing, to come into Kabul. But the Taliban had by then had a solidified hierarchical structure. They took over the country. They took over Kabul. Ashraf Ghani fled the country, and so did many of his advisors. And then there was a mass exodus that took place. And the understanding was that they had to get out as many people who worked with the U.S. The U.S. intervention in Afghanistan over 20 years. They had to withdraw them because they feared that the Taliban would come in and there would be mass killings and mass, basically a lot of revenge killings would take place. And so we led that withdrawal. We pulled out of Afghanistan, and it was supposed to be a phased pullout, but that didn't happen. The phased withdrawal did not happen. And so once Kabul fell on August 15th, there was chaos. As everybody remembers, people were holding on to the airplanes and rushing to the airport out. And, we were able to withdraw over 150,000 people, a little bit more. The majority that came to the U.S. and have resettled in the U.S., but are in legal limbo now. And many of them went to Canada, to Europe, to the UK, Germany, Australia. And so that was the scenario of the withdrawal that took place in 2021.
So now that the Taliban are in charge, they have consolidated their positions. There were no mass killings right afterwards, even though many were left behind. So I think at least in that sense, it was a positive development. I want to show you some data about Afghanistan, and then we can talk about it. So if you look at it, I'm looking at 3 years, 2001 before our invasion of Afghanistan, and then 2021 after our withdrawal, and the current numbers. So if you compare to Ukraine, which the population of Ukraine in 4.5 years of fighting has decreased by more than 20%. But Afghanistan's population doubled during the 20 years of war, which I find absolutely stunning. That there were 20 million when we attacked them, and there were 40 million when it's like two Afghanistans now, literally. Yeah, so that is quite surprising. And in fact, they are growing at such an incredible pace. They have added 10% to their populations since the Taliban have come in. But if you look at the size of the economy, there is a general growth in the economy, but part of it is because of the population growth. But if you look at the per capita income, it is just one of the poorest countries. On the Human Development Index, it has been steadily in the decline, which I find surprising. If you look at 170 in 2001 and 180, so after 20 years of Western intervention, its HDI ranking went down by 10 rather than going up. So there was not any developmental contribution from the 20 years of Western. I mean, they made malls and they built infrastructure for military occupation, but I didn't think it developed the country at all. And since the Taliban took over, it has become worse. Even literacy is declining. If you look at the numbers, it is terrible, especially because of the way the women are treated.
Right.
And the diplomatic relations, the poor guys have never had any recognition internationally in this whole century. There were three countries that recognized them in 2001, and now there's only one, which is Russia. So how do you assess what the Taliban have done in the last 5 years in terms of their positive contribution, if any, towards stability, and if they have done any harm? How do you see this?
Yeah, no, this is a very good question. Taking a bit of a step back to your original point of, there was 20 years of NATO, not just the U.S. It really was NATO investment in Afghanistan. Everyone really invested after 9/11. It was the U.S., the U.K., Germany, Turkey, Spain, Italy. I mean, Canada. Everybody really invested in Afghanistan. But But the challenge was that investment was not an organic and authentic investment that took place. Initially, when the government, there was a couple of years after 2001, and then after the Bonn agreement, there was a few years of stability, and then the Taliban were able to re-emerge and rearm and start to engage in military activity again. The majority of the money spent in Afghanistan.
Haris, I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but where did they get the money and weapons, the Taliban, in the early years?
Well, you have to remember, Afghanistan is a landlocked country with a lot of with a lot of neighbors who have always been very suspicious of what Afghanistan does, right? Afghanistan historically was a buffer country.
Yeah.
It's landlocked. It's a good buffer state. It's a tribal society. It is also a very difficult topography in Afghanistan, where the land is very hard to control and settle. So historically, that's been the challenge. And so when the Taliban started to reemerge, and the initial mistakes that the U.S. and NATO made was they did not integrate the Taliban into the Bonn Agreement and bring them into the government. Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, specifically these two individuals, Hamid Karzai, when they selected him to lead the Afghan government, and Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the Afghan American who was essentially and even Colin Powell at that time, who was Secretary of State, they wanted the Taliban, Mullah Brother, and a group of the Taliban to actually be integrated to the new governance structure, because they believed if they did that, and Mullah Omar at that point had given the blessing to the Taliban leadership to go ahead and do that. That was an interesting development in Kandahar. Before he left Kandahar and went to probably Pakistan or Kuwait or somewhere else, he had given the blessings to Mullah Brother and the leadership of the Taliban to say, go ahead and negotiate with the new government and NATO forces. And when Karzai proposed to integrate the Taliban leadership, the moderate Taliban leadership, into the structure, specifically Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney refused that request. And, at that time, the hysteria of post 9/11 world, they were sending people to Guantanamo Bay. It was either you're on our side or not. And that was the first critical mistake that the U.S. and NATO forces made, was not integrating the Taliban into the Bonn Agreement and into the governance structure. So when that happened, the Taliban started looking for support. Of course, Pakistan knew that the U.S. was not going to stay in Afghanistan forever. So Pakistan made a strategic decision to say, we have to be able to play both sides because we don't know when these guys are leaving. And so there was Pakistanis who in the ISI and other establishment who said, we're going to continue to support. So Kuwait became essentially the headquarters of the Taliban in many ways. The Iranians were very suspicious of having America on its border.
Yeah, obviously.
Obviously, as you can see why now, the Iranians were very suspicious. So the Iranians started to fund and support. Of course, the Russians have always been suspicious of U.S. involvement in that area. So the Russians also supported the Taliban. And then the drug trade and the illicit black market trade in Afghanistan was immense, because remember, 30 years prior to that, there was no real government in Afghanistan. It was a war economy, and there was a lot of drug economy. So that continued and that flourished. And that's how the Taliban were able to get the resources and buy the weapons and get the support to actually then reemerge as this powerful entity. And it was an ideological and ethnic entity. And so it's very a very hierarchical structure that's very disciplined. We haven't seen such discipline in Afghanistan in a group really in a very long time. So that's how they were able to reemerge.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the war. So when NATO went in, it became a war economy. We talk about investing $2-3 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last 20 years. That $2-3 trillion, the majority of that money went to defense contractors. It came back to us. It was not invested in the local economies. It was not, like you said, there was malls built, there were some roads built, there was an immense amount of corruption. because of the structure of funding that went into these countries, whether it was Iraq or Afghanistan. So there was an elite few that became the kind of oligarchs of that country. They received the contracts, the construction contracts, the military contracts, the gas contracts, the oil contracts. A small group of people started to benefit. So this war economy developed in Afghanistan. And the amount of actual US aid and development that went in that was organic to build society was minimal. Because once the Taliban started to reemerge, the areas that you needed to invest in, you didn't even have access to invest in. So you were investing in major cities like Kabul, Mazar, Herat, and a few others, and they were being built up, and they are being built up. If you look at Kabul now, Kabul is a very different Kabul than 25 years ago, or Herat or Mazar. You have very modern infrastructure in certain places. You have housing complexes, you have apartment buildings, malls, and you have an economy that's there's potential, but the corruption really was what internally rotted the system in many ways. And when you're dependent on a foreign entity like that, you have limited say on what you can actually do. And when I speak to friends who were in senior levels in the Afghan government under Karzai and under Ghani, they'll tell me we didn't have autonomy. The U.S. approved
Yeah.
every decision that we made, whether it was a cabinet level appointee or a general appointee. We had to have the blessings of the U.S. So the U.S. never really understood the system and how to create a real solid central, and then also kind of diverse.
And the US did not even respect those government. I mean, if you remember the humiliating experience of getting the Afghan president to come and answer questions in a Senate hearing as if he was, accountable to the US Senate and not to his own people. I mean, that was so disgraceful. I think I didn't know what to say at that time because I was like aghast that he would come here and answer questions. I mean, we give more money to Netanyahu. Can you imagine him answering questions from U.S. senator? He will lecture them from the podium with the both houses standing up and clapping. Right? You can see the difference. But
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but now that the Taliban have been in charge for 5 years,
Yeah.
how has Afghanistan developed? Is there anything positive to talk about?
Yeah, and I think this is where the challenge. People are very polarized when it comes to this issue. When you ask this question, so if you say anything positive about the Taliban, you're considered a Talib sympathizer, which I am not in any way. If you're honest, you have to be honest about the situation. So the one thing the Taliban have done, which everybody will admit to, is they've been able to bring security to the country. Part of it is because they were the ones who were causing the insecurity in the country. So,
It's true.
if you're the
Yeah.
one who was doing the suicide bombings and you're the ones doing the attacks and you're the ones causing instability, when you take over, there's no one really there to cause that level of instability. So the thing that the Taliban have done well, and that has not been achieved in Afghanistan for the past 50 years after the fall after the fall of the king Zahir Shah, and then the Soviet invasion following that, is they've been able to consolidate power and actually control the absolute majority of the country. There are very tiny portions of the country where there's some fighting in the north in Badakhshan, and that's happening now in more recent months. But the Taliban have been able to consolidate power, which is not easy in Afghanistan, as I mentioned, because of the topography, the ethnic makeup of Afghanistan, and all of the other challenges. That's one thing they've done well, right? They've brought safety and security to the country. This is why you see Western YouTubers and influencers going to Kabul and going to Kandahar and going to Herat and going to these amusement parks. And so they've been able to bring a level of stability. So that's the one thing that they've done well. The other, unfortunately, other than that, what they haven't been able to do in any way is, based on the numbers that you just showed, even though there is stability there, they haven't been able to bring any level of advancement, prosperity, or movement. Number one, the most basic level, is, of course, that you don't allow half or more than half the population, because Afghanistan has gone through 50 years of war. The men have been at war for so long, so it's a majority female society. You have completely cut off half of the population of the country from education, from employment, and many of these mothers and women have had to provide for their children because the father has died in a war or has been killed or in an attack. And so that in itself has caused a lot of challenges in
How do they
Afghanistan.
survive? How do they survive? They're not allowed to work. They're not allowed to even go out without a mahram and all of that. So
Yeah.
how do these women households survive? Like charity?
It's mostly charity and remittances. Remittances,
Um,
Afghans around the country, around the world send remittances, including my family. Our family has a school and an orphanage in Kabul that we support on a regular basis. My brothers invest a lot of time and energy and money and resources. And a lot of Afghans around the world, that is what they do. A lot of their remittances go to Afghanistan to support their relatives, their families, and the less fortunate. And then there's charities. It is a charity based. Over 85% of the country lives under the poverty line, and so the country is a heavily aid dependent society, like it was during the NATO years. But with that, it was NATO giving the aid. Now it's private charities, it's family members and remittances.
so I looked at a couple of things. So one thing that there are two things that apparently the Taliban have succeeded in doing, or three things. They have consolidated power over the whole
Yeah,
territory nearly. That's one achievement. The second is that they have to some extent managed to reduce the influence of ISIS and Al Qaeda, even though those organizations
yeah,
still exist. But for example, they're not a threat to the West. I mean, if they are a threat, they are
correct.
to Pakistan or to Afghanistan itself.
Right.
And
Yeah,
maybe Central Asia, the Central Asians, Russians, Chinese fear them, but like especially with ISIS Khorasan. But the third thing, apparently, they are doing a great job of collecting taxes. The
yes,
Taliban have,
yes,
so there is state revenue. I think they are doing better than Pakistan when it comes to collecting taxes.
correct.
So the state has some money because of the revenue. But other than that, when I look at it, they are still, so Afghanistan has, there are two worlds. There is one world which is engaging with Afghanistan, right?
Yeah,
So if you look at Russia, China,
right.
India, and some Muslim countries, from Azerbaijan to Qatar, UAE, all of these countries are engaging. They have
Yeah,
some rudimentary diplomatic presence, even though nobody is recognizing. Like India engages Afghanistan but doesn't recognize the Taliban government. So they have even embassies operating. But
yeah,
when I look at the aid structure, after Trump got elected, the US stopped its aid. But the aid is coming only from countries which don't engage with Afghanistan, which is Western countries. So you have UK, European Union is the biggest donor now.
yeah,
Japan is giving money,
yeah,
Switzerland, Canada, and others. So it's about roughly 1.7 to $2 billion, and the US has now completely stopped its aid. So they are struggling to raise the 1.7 that they need for this year, and
right.
they're not giving the money to the Taliban, so there are still NGOs operating, which I think raises the overhead cost of,
Yeah,
a lot of money is going to be spent on people who are going to do the aid. But like, do the Taliban have a plan? Like, it appears to me that they're just trying to struggle to get recognition, and they're trying to get some aid, foreign aid. But why have they doubled down on this women issue? I don't understand. Like, we, is it that important for them that they would eschew international record? Because I think that, it's very easy to do. They need to change one person somewhere in an important position, and the new guy can say, "Okay, we are reversing policy. We will
yeah,
bring schools back," and they don't even have to spend. I think the international community will pay for the schools for
yeah,
women and colleges. Right, the money will come in
yeah,
quickly, and they could do that and immediately get recognition. They don't even have a seat in the UN. They're
yeah.
still controlled by the previous government. So, like, what is the point of all of this?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. That's a question that everybody asks. There's a couple of things. You mentioned something. You said they do counterterrorism very well. So
Yeah,
that was something that they had committed to the U.S. and to
and they
NATO,
did
and
it.
they did extremely well. Right? There's ISIS, Al Qaeda. I mean, they took out Ayman Zawahiri right away, and that was definitely someone inside of the Taliban who gave that intelligence. So the counterterrorism has done well. The third thing that you said is that they've started to bring in aid from certain areas. They've also, the other thing they've done well is also start to bring in investment into the country, as you mentioned in the beginning. So you
Yeah.
have a lot of expats who from the Middle East, from places like Dubai, from Europe, from Australia, who have gone into one of the billionaires in Dubai, Mirais Azizi, has gone in and committed a $5 billion in infrastructure development in Afghanistan. And so they are starting to attract a lot of investors in Afghanistan because really there's, it's a field that's wide open. So that's another thing that they've slowly started to do well in and bring people in. Now, when it comes to the ideological issue, especially around girls and women, you have to remember that the Taliban, the way they were able to function over 20 years, recruit people, pull people in, was a grievance-based fighting and recruitment structure. First grievance was the occupiers, the colonialists, the Kafirs are coming in and taking our land, right? So they've taken our land. They're oppressing us like the Russians did before and the British did before. So that narrative, that's how they recruited. They recruited because there was drones killing people, and there was, night raids that were humiliating families that the U.S. and NATO forces were doing. But then there was also an ideological component to all of this. So, it was a lot about, Islamic and Pashtun culture and identity. That look at these cities, look at Kabul and look at Herat and look at Mazar. Women are going to school. They're allowed to go drive. They're allowed to go public. This is against our religion. This is against our identity. This is against our culture. And that's how they used to recruit people, right? And in all honesty, Afghanistan is still a very conservative society. Other than very small city pockets, Afghanistan in general is a conservative society. If you go to certain villages, you're going to get certain types of conservative understanding, not only in the Pashtun areas, but other areas as well. So that's another thing to understand. So if the Taliban came in day one and said, you know what, we're going to allow girls to go to school, you can work, they would have an internal crisis on their hand. The people who they have ideologically built an infrastructure, a very disciplined, hierarchical, military, social, and ideological infrastructure, those people will be the first ones to say, well, we fought for 20 years because you told us women were allowed to go to school, that they were corrupting our women, that they were corrupting our society, and now you're allowing this to happen under our rule, under Islamic law, under the Sharia law. And so they would have a legitimacy problem, number one, with the internal infrastructure that they have. And, if you go to places like Kabul and other areas, the police force, the security forces, they're very ideological. They are ideologically driven. In the Republic time, corruption was immense because people had no real investment in the system. It was, how do I make money? The police were corrupt. The army was corrupt. The governance structure was corrupt because people were just trying to take a dime. That corruption, to a large extent, not fully, but to a large extent, has gone away. As you mentioned, like in the tax collection, right? In the tax revenue, the Taliban has really minimized the corruption. The borders, collecting tolls on the borders and border fees. All of that used to be controlled by warlords who would siphon off 30 to 40 to 60% of that from different points of entry into the borders. The Taliban have completely cleaned that up. And they have, because they need the money, because they're not reliant on outside finances, they have become excellent tax collectors, both from outside revenue coming in and also internally. Even stalls inside of Kabul shops, they're paying their taxes on time because you have tax collectors. And the way they frame it is that's their Islamic duty, it's their cultural duty to do this. So that's one of the reasons why the Taliban cannot right away go into because they'll have a sense of legitimacy that they'll lose. The second thing is, this current leadership in Kandahar is extremely ideological. It is extremely ideological. So there's multiple factions within the Taliban. You have within the Kandari Central Power Center, you have the Amir al-Mu'mineen that they have, and his group of individuals, Hibatullah, his power structure, and then you have Mullah brother, and then you have the son of the former supreme leader Mullah Omar, who's the defense minister, and they're a more pragmatic, moderate wing that's closer to some of the folks in the Gulf, and who are able to bring the investment. And then you have the Haqqani network that joined the Taliban, and that's where you have Sirajuddin Haqqani and Anas Haqqani and his forces. Now, there's a lot of internal disagreement. The most ideological one of this group is the one in Kandahar who is the current supreme leader and leading the government. And so you have both an ideological understanding, and they really view the world in this way. This is not just like, them acting on some whim. They view the world in this way, and they also understand the internal dynamics that this will cause. Now, if you talk to their sympathizers, they're going to say it's a matter of time. Give it a little bit of time. It will change. In Saudi Arabia, women couldn't drive. That changed over time. Yeah. And so for them, it's that argument that the leadership will evolve and it'll change. But if you talk to people who pragmatically are living on the ground, how do you allow a society to be handicapped for another generation? They're not even allowing female now nurses and physicians. And there used to be a time when they would allow actual medical female staff. Even that is minimized, almost completely cut off. So
which means that the healthcare of women will also decline.
Will decline 100%.
Yeah, they're not going to go to men.
They won't allow their women to go to male physicians and nurses and doctors. So so that's the problem with this argument that says that give them time and they'll evolve. But so that's the dynamic that's internally playing out. The the moderates within them, quote unquote moderates amongst the Taliban, they will say it's a matter of time. Things will change. It'll develop. Girls will eventually be able to go to school. They'll say things like, we had to change the curriculum because the curricula was completely Western influenced, and we don't want our women. So give us time to change the curriculum.
If they say the curriculum was woke, they might even get support from the US.
That's true.
I want to turn towards their foreign policy. There have been some significant changes since the Taliban came. One is that the relations with Pakistan. What went wrong, Harris? What has happened? They are on the verge of an endless war themselves, right? Like, what is the problem there? Besides the fact that there is TPP and...
Yeah. So, this is the most fascinating thing for me, because the Taliban were supposed to be the project of Pakistan and Afghanistan to really move this along. And you remember the famous
hotel
the ISI went to Kabul and he said everything will be okay and gave a thumbs up, and that this was probably the most shocking development in the Taliban foreign policy arena. I think a few things went wrong. Number one, the Taliban relied heavily on the TTP infrastructure to get done what they did in Afghanistan, right? They had to really rely on the Pakistani Taliban to help with fighting, with training, with just complete reliance. There was back and forth. When there was a jihad, quote unquote jihad in Afghanistan, everybody can focus on that. When the jihad finished in Afghanistan and the occupiers were kicked out, according to them, the TPP had to they can't fight the Kabul government anymore. What are they going to do? They're not going to put their arms down. And they had this sense of achievement that if we could do it in Afghanistan, maybe we could actually do this in Islamabad as well. Like we could maybe if we can't take the whole country, but maybe we can take the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa region and establish an emirate there as well. And so that put the Afghan Taliban in a situation where the people that they had relied on, 40 to 50,000 people that they had relied on for shelter, for support, and they're tribal family members, and they go back and forth and have married within each other. Do we turn on these people? Do we try to co-opt them? They were getting pressure from Islamabad telling them we need to deal with this. And so I think what the Taliban did initially was said, let's bring you guys to Afghanistan. You guys should settle down. We have the Islamic Emirates established now. You can totally relax, live your lives here. But that's not the reality. These people were used to fighting. They wanted to take the fight to Pakistan. And that's where initially all of the challenges started to develop, is that the Pakistani government, Islamabad, wanted them to clamp down, and the Taliban just could not clamp down the way they were able to clamp down on Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Khorasan, and the other groups, because they had this fraternity. And also the Pakistani Taliban were much stronger because this was their home. They weren't outsiders. And so that put a lot of strain on the relationship there, because, in all honesty, you were having this Pakistan Taliban who were in Afghanistan in the day, coming into Pakistan doing night raids, killing soldiers and police officers, and going back into Afghanistan during the day. And a lot of life was being lost on the Pakistani side. And so at one point, Pakistan basically said, this has to be solved. And I think at that point, the Afghan Taliban were stuck. They didn't know what to do. And so the relationship started to deteriorate. And then things like, of course, the border issues came up, and border security came up. And Pakistan then retaliated as well and said, we're going to deport 4 million Afghans from Pakistan back to Afghanistan. In a country that's already struggling, imagine taking 3 to 4 million people overnight who have lived in Pakistan for decades. You're taking them back and you're straining the economic and social system. And they did that. Close to 3 million people were sent back to Afghanistan. And that put a huge strain on the Afghan economy, infrastructure, and people are still struggling because of that. And of course, then India will always be India, saw an opening in that relationship and started to move in and send aid and started to invest in Afghanistan, and was talking about agricultural development and aid, and the famous visit where the Taliban's Minister of Agriculture went to India. He was treated like the Afghan Prime Minister and President, taken all over the country in India. He was just the Minister of Agriculture. So those different things really put a strain on that relationship. And I think when Trump arrived and Pakistan became a darling of the Trump administration, General Munir and the president and the prime minister, they're very close to this administration. In many ways, they're very close to this administration. And I think Pakistan felt like they had a green light to do what they wanted to do in Afghanistan, that there would be no pushback from the US, there would be no pushback from Europe. And they did. They started these bombing raids, and they started, and it was they wanted to send a message to the Taliban that we have the capacity to hurt you. But it mostly killed innocent people. They did attack some TPP camps. But other than that, it's this tit for tat that they're stuck in now. And I think China is trying to help resolve this issue. But it was the spiral that happened.
So basically, it is the TTP. These are the people that Imran Khan let out of the jail also, if you remember, right? You have thousands of them who were in prisons were let out by Imran Khan. So these are the people who are essentially holding the foreign policy of both Afghanistan and Pakistan hostage. So where are we now with the Taliban? I mean, are they good? India's support to Afghanistan is quite cynical.
Yeah,
I say jokingly that actually this is a marriage made in heaven. Radical Islam, radical Hindu, Hindu nationalists, and Taliban. When this is Hindu Taliban and Muslim Taliban, they are getting together.
yes,
It's perfect marriage.
yeah,
In fact, right now the best relations that India has in South Asia is with
it
Afghans.
was,
And you ask Indians, especially the right wing part of India, which is your biggest enemy, they will say radical Islam because they're
yeah,
adopting a lot of jargon from Israel. But so, what is the future? What do you see Afghanistan? Okay, there's some
yeah,
progress. There is peace. I agree. There's to be 3 to 5 thousand deaths per year minimum, and now it's like next to zero inside Afghanistan. I mean, all the killing is being done now by the Pakistanis rather than internally,
right,
right?
certainly,
So,
yeah.
where do you see going? Like, do you see any chances that there will be international recognition? Will it increase now that Russia has opened the door? I don't know why India is not following through. And so, what do you think are how do you see the scenario unfolding in the next 2 3 years with Afghanistan? Because it remains critical. People in Central Asian countries are still China, Russia are still very concerned, and so are the Western countries about potential terrorism coming out of Afghanistan. So, so what do you see happening?
The one place that we did not talk about that I think is the most important geostrategic partner of the Taliban are the Chinese and China.
Mhm.
I think right now the Taliban and Afghanistan's reliance on China has skyrocketed. The amount of investment that China is doing in Afghanistan is immense. And of course, mineral development and the most of it on the black market, rare minerals, infrastructure investment. So a lot is happening from China, and I think that is one area that because China does everything quietly. They're not like us in the West, where we kind of go in and with our bravado and our tanks and our planes, and then leave 20 years later. China is very quiet in how it does it's almost sometimes an occupational force, but really quiet economic occupation, social occupation. So China is definitely a large player and someone that the Taliban are looking towards helping, get international recognition eventually. So that's one area that the Taliban feel that they've been successful in co-opting, like Kabul right now. Kabul has a very modern CCTV monitoring system. The Taliban can see everything around the city, and that's based on the Chinese model. The Chinese have established that infrastructure to allow for monitoring and surveillance. So China is a big player in this. I think there's a few developments that are happening. There is starting now, which is a bit
But
scary.
Harris, if
Yeah,
Afghanistan and Pakistan both become Chinese assets in the
yeah.
region, wouldn't they want peace between them and put pressure to shut the TTP down?
Well, I think that's what China has been trying to do. So the detente that took place right now, there's a detente between the Taliban and Pakistan, and that was facilitated to a large extent by China. The Chinese don't want to see them at war. The Chinese want safety and security in that corridor and in that region. So the Chinese are trying. I think I don't know how soon they'll be able to bring in kind of full relationship, because the TTP is a problem that's going to be there for a while. But the Chinese are definitely trying. Now, what I think the Taliban are hoping, and this is what their strategy is. The Taliban want slow international recognition. They don't want overnight recognition, and I think they've come to this conclusion and process. The one thing that's happening now, there are flare-ups of violence and fighting that is happening in the northern region of Afghanistan right now. And I always remember, this is what the Taliban did. The Taliban waited 4 to 5 years. In 2006-7 initially is when they were able to regroup and start to come back and fight, because it took them a while to regroup after 2001. And I think there's a sense that there are some groups, now it's been 5 years, they've been able to regroup, They've been able to attract some investors and weapons, and there might be some more violence by the opposition in the north that we're seeing slowly. I don't know how that's going to play out, if they will have enough support. I don't think they'll have the same type of support that the Taliban had, because people do not want regional instability in that way.
Mhm.
So the Taliban slowly want recognition. I think the Taliban's eye right now is on Europe. There are European countries who, if they see a little bit of progress, are willing to do more business with the Taliban.
And
And
they're giving
so,
money.
yes, they're giving, like you said, they're giving money already. They're giving money. They're investing in a lot of charity, humanitarian work. So I
Mhm.
think that's where the eye of the Taliban are. They know that they have Russia. They know they have the support of China. They'll have to deal with the India and Pakistan. I always say India's investment in Afghanistan always was symbolic. It wasn't like major. They would build hospitals. They would build,
The
a few
parliament.
things,
Yeah.
parliament and things like that. But there was no deep investment. For
It's less
India,
than
it's all
it's about 2 billion overall in 20 years.
yeah, exactly. Which is really nothing in the long scheme of things. So the Taliban feel like if they keep the stability and they slowly evolve, that Europe will eventually come on board, and that the Germans and the British and the Swiss and the Dutch, these people will slowly come on board, and then they'll wait to eventually get recognition from the U.S. The Taliban have a frustration with the U.S. right now. Their frustration with the U.S. is that the U.S. has a singular focus in Afghanistan, that is intelligence and hostages. So there's a few hostages, Americans, that remain in Afghanistan, and the Taliban are frustrated that the majority of the communications of the U.S. is either intelligence based or focused on these hostages, and they are looking to find ways to make inroads in Washington in different ways. But right now, I think the Taliban are really looking to try to see if they can.
Why are they keeping the hostages?
I think it's leverage. This is always a leverage game. This is what they know very well. They were good at this for 20 years, right? You take a hostage, you get ransom, you get I think the Taliban so the Taliban are brilliant at negotiating, and I hate to say this, they have learned negotiation, tactical negotiation, not strategic negotiation, extremely well. They've learned it from the North Koreans, they've learned it from others, and they know how to negotiate. I mean, the way they negotiated with the US was just like, it was really surprising.
No, they were quite sophisticated in the way. I mean, I think that Muttaqi was also part of the negotiations. He
Yes,
was doing
yes,
a better job than
yeah.
some of the our own Afghans here
Mhm.
in the Trump administration. In the
That's right.
yeah. So my last question to you is that, given that they like, what do, like, if I were to, I have tried to invite Muttaqi to come on my show. Obviously, he is not interested. There are some people who speak their English beautifully. Some of them
Very well. Yeah,
who
yeah,
are in the foreign, yeah, they're clearly people who have grown up in UK or Germany. I
yeah.
think one of the foreign policy person. So I've tried to invite them, but no one seems to take me seriously. And the reason why I'm wearing this is because I am a Yusufzai Pathan, and so so I have some kind of lineage. I don't know. Someday I will have to do a DNA test to check out how much of me is an Afghan. But like, if I were to ask this question of their grand leader, or anybody in the Taliban leadership, as to, like, what is their goal for Afghanistan? Like, what do they want Afghanistan to become? I mean, do they have a role model? Do they, like, it can't be like, Saudi Arabia. They don't have natural. They have minerals, but not oil. So, like,
Yeah.
what do the Taliban want? Like, for their people, for their country.
Yeah. I think you'll get different answers from different leadership, and this is the key. So, from a very ideological wing of the Taliban, you will get the answer that we fought to remove the occupation, the colonizers. We fought for an Islamic state, an Islamic system, and that is what we want, regardless of the price that we have to pay. That is what you'll get. But then there are other more pragmatic and moderate wings where you'll get, No, we want to create a modern state that can take care of the people, that can be independent, that can be responsive to the needs of the people, and you that is the group like Mullah Brother and these guys. Their main focus right now is investment. They want money to come in. They want development to happen. They're very close to business leaders around the world. They're always in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or in Doha trying to attract businesses. And I think from that group, you'll get we want to, of course, keep our culture and our faith, but we want a modern system that's responsive to the people, and we want to compromise and get there. And then you've got another group of folks within Taliban that are even more pragmatic and want to change much quicker and say, we need to make these changes. We need international recognition. We need to be very pragmatic, and move forward. So you'll have those three strains. And now the question is, how, where are they going to land? This is the question, right? And who's going to really win that argument internally? What's been really surprising, and actually, if you look at it, interesting, is the cohesiveness of the leadership structure of the Taliban. There was a lot of people saying that there's going to be factions, they're going to fracture, they're going to be a civil war, that there is no way that they can actually work together. They have their differences internally, but once they leave the room, whether it's in Kandahar or in Kabul or wherever it is, they are very cohesive, and they show the world that they're cohesive, unless you have, of course, deep knowledge. But what's been really fascinating is watching how cohesive they have been. They have not allowed that fracture to go into the structure of the Taliban, the membership and the soldiers and the tribal leaders and command structure. And that's actually quite impressive. I think a lot of people are surprised by that. So because they have that, it's going to be interesting to see what happens next, what route they take, and to see which faction will actually play out.
So in terms of Afghan future, it is about China and Europe, not about India, Pakistan, or the US. Is that an accurate statement?
I think you can't get away from the Pakistan question. Yes, the India question, they don't have to focus on. The U.S., they don't have to focus on. They have their agreements. There's intelligence sharing. There is intelligence sharing happening between the U.S. and the Taliban. This is real.
Yeah.
There definitely are intelligence assets in Kabul, in the Central Asian countries. There's sharing and talking happening. So I don't want to discount that. That is happening. But that's more on a counter intelligence sharing. But then you have people, you have like Trump will every once in a while say, "I want Bagram Air Base back." Like he'll make a claim like that. And so you can even say, what, the U.S. doesn't matter that much right now, but Pakistan is going to matter. The largest border with Afghanistan is Pakistan. Pakistanis and Afghans have a very deep cultural, social connection. Afghans live on the Pakistan side and have for decades and have businesses and homes, and they go back and forth. They're the biggest trading partners in that region. There's a huge illicit market that happens. If they don't get that under control, that can be problematic. That issue has to be addressed somehow. It can't. The status quo is not going to work too long because it won't be good for Afghanistan. Afghanistan needs that economic and social support from Pakistan, or it's not even from the government, from Pakistan civil society and businesses. So that has to be figured out somehow. But it's hard because the TTP, you have to realize there's more Pashtuns on the Pakistan side than there are on the Afghan side. And that is a big deal. And there's affinity. Like that border just doesn't erase affinity. The border doesn't erase.
KPK is as big as Afghanistan, isn't it, in terms of population in the province?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the reality. So you can't get away from figuring something out there, because that'll come back and haunt both Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Pakistan has its own internal challenges. It's dealing with Balochistan. It's dealing with KPK. It's like there's so much Kashmir now. There's so much happening in Pakistan where they're having to deal with all these different issues. So that has to be addressed. But yeah, China, Europe, and Pakistan has to be are probably the areas they need to focus on.
Haris, this was absolutely wonderful masterclass on Afghanistan, and I hope that your voice is heard more often. I see that there has been a decline in the attention that Afghanistan has been getting, especially under the Trump 2.0. I do see some activism in the community. There is a backlash in terms of, I think Afghans are also a victim of the new anti-terror, anti-immigration,
Oh yeah,
anti-refugee policies of the Trump
oh yeah.
administration. Yeah,
And
and
that's
I
the
think
really sad part of it is that you have all of these people who supported the U.S. for 20 years, gave their lives, their families, put themselves in danger. We brought them here. Now, because of this administration's anti-immigration sentiment and almost kind of like, you know, just fascist leanings by some people in this administration, those 100,000 plus people are in legal limbo. And I hear from them all the time. It's sad.
look at the diaspora. So, for example, the Afghan diaspora supported the U.S. and now they have been betrayed. Look at the Pakistanis who supported the Trump administration. Now they feel completely betrayed, especially on the Imran Khan issue. The Iranians thought they would get a king. The Iranian diaspora is now as upset with Trump as anybody else. I think it is a lesson. I think that that the US unfortunately has in the past 10, 20 years behaved more and more like Great Britain in some
Yeah.
of the countries of the global south. And for people who have relied on the US, whether it was Kurds in Iraq or whether the Afghans, uh, they have been punished for being with the US. I'm sad to say, and at some point, right now, it's impossible even to raise this issue because of the anti-immigrant sentiment in the West in general. But I think
Yeah.
that the West as a reliable partner has become a big issue, I think, for most people in the country. So,
100%. And you know, on imperialism, the British, I'll say this, the British knew how to do imperialism much better than the Americans know how to do imperialism. We're
oh,
not good at imperialism.
it's
And so,
because we
yeah,
are so militarily so much stronger, we
exactly.
miss all the other important things.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
other than the use of force, and that's why
Yeah,
we end up being not as good as the Brits. Anyway,
yeah.
thank you very much, Harris, for
Thank
joining
you so
us,
much,
and I
Dr. Khan.
wish the Afghans all the best. And uh, I mean, all said and done, I think that they should not allow a generation of women. And let me tell you, if the women are not allowed to be part of the public sphere, if their healthcare is not taken care of, if their education, the next generation of Afghan men will also be quite
100%.
deficient in all
100%.
forms. So they cannot fly on one wing and hope to reach anywhere. Thank you very
No,
much,
not a.
Harris.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khan.